My subject is war and the pity of war. Welcome, Year 11. This presentation has been made to assist you in preparing for your upcoming exams. We will be looking at the poetry of Wilfred Owen. In order to assist you, you should have a copy of the poetry booklet with you and press pause at the relevant screen to take notes. Let's begin. Firstly, it's important to know what the rubric requires of you. And with Wilfred Owen, it will require knowledge and appreciation of all his poems. In particular, you should focus on two poems and draw conclusions about his message and his purpose from these two poems. So look at the checklist in front of you. Do you have an understanding of his context? Do you know what the poems are about, the content? What about his key themes or ideas? Are you able to form thesis points around them? The better responses will also be aware of his structure and form. Think about the techniques as well. Try and pick original and relevant techniques. And then, of course, in the two poems that you are using, make sure that you can draw comparisons between them. Let's start with context. Obviously, Wilfred Owen was writing a long time ago. He was writing during World War I. Find out a little bit about who he was, his religious background. Find out about why he wrote his poetry. What message was he trying to convey? You should have done some introductory work on his context, but now is a good time to revise it. So on the screen in front of you, you can see some key elements to consider. Perhaps more than anything else, the most important is that he himself partook in the war. So his writing is authentic. He is writing from the first-hand experience of somebody who experienced the horrors and the atrocities of World War I. There are some general themes that you are probably familiar with that run through all of the poems set for study. The most important thing is to form a thesis point about the themes. So don't just say that he writes about war or he writes about the horror of war. Try and form a thesis point, an idea about why he does that. And we'll talk more about that later. With the poems, it would be a good idea to have a general understanding of all the poems. This is particularly so for next year when they could stipulate a poem. This year you will have a choice, two poems that you can use in the essay. Make sure for all the poems though, you can say something interesting and valuable. So what I've got here for you, I've started a table for each of the poems. It is by no means complete. It's just to give you an idea of the content of each of the poems and a couple of techniques to get you started. You should certainly fill in the tables, particularly of the two poems that you wish to focus on for the exam. A lot of people find his last poem on our list, Strange Meeting, very difficult, and it is indeed so. But Siegfried Sassoon himself, Owen's mentor, called this poem Owen's passport to immortality. If this poem is one that appeals to you, and if you like a challenge, certainly think about using it, as it's probably a poem that many students will shy away from because it is quite challenging. Now that you've done an overview of each of the poems, it is up to you to decide which two poems you are going to focus on. Ideally, you would choose two poems that resonate with you, but also consider some of the similarities and differences between the poems, because that is something you should also refer to in your response. So on the two poems that you have decided, you should actually deconstruct them in significant detail. Here is an example done for you on The Next War. So you can see there's quite a lot of deconstruction. We talk about themes, we talk about form, we talk about poetic techniques. You should be able to do this much for each of the 2 poems that you are going to prepare for the exam. One thing that a lot of students do ignore, and something that you should certainly focus on, is the marking criteria. So what you've got in front of you are 3 marking criteria, and these marking criteria come from the top band. If you can effectively respond to the question, then that would put you in the top band. I've actually deconstructed them for you in yellow brackets just after, just to sort of trim them down. So the first one is making sure that you have original and relevant ideas. The second one is making sure that you have strong textual evidence and analysis. And the third one is the way you write. This is a formal response, so you must use formal essay writing style and structure it in an appropriate manner. An introduction is incredibly important. It sets the tone for your whole essay and a framework that should make it easy for the examiner to follow your argument. Make sure you address the question. That might seem obvious, but there are some students who have a prepared response and don't really change it too much to fit the question on the day. Obviously, you would introduce his name and also the 2 poems that you have chosen to study. As well as that, in the intro, you should give the marker an idea of the key themes and ideas that you are going to explore. The body paragraphs, of course, are the main part of your essay, and it would be a really good idea to make sure they're structured well. The peel structure is one that you should be familiar with. You set up the point, you explain, you then give evidence, I would say at least 2 to 3 examples, perhaps more, and then you link it back to your thesis. And at the end, maybe consider what's new, what you've been challenged with in this particular poem. Before you move on to the next poem, make sure you have some kind of a transition sentence. So you might start with similarly or conversely to introduce the second poem. This is just a guide to how you might prepare one particular poem. The theme would be the inhuman slaughter of men in war. We're going to use Anthem for Doomed Youth. We're going to comment on the theme. Okay? So the comment is something where you expand on the theme rather than just identify it. And that is where your thesis point comes in. Obviously, you'd have quite a few techniques along with the analysis to support your argument. So you would do something like this for Anthem and whatever other poem you were doing if you were doing Anthem. A lot of students sometimes, pay very little attention to a conclusion. A conclusion actually should be something that you give a lot of thought to. Remember, it is the last thing that the marker looks at before they put a mark on your paper. End with a bang and not a whimper. Think about what you've said, how it's relevant to the question. How are we challenged by the text? And again, end with a strong statement. The worst thing you can do, apart from actually not having time for a conclusion at all, is to simply repeat the question. So here we have a sample question with an intro. And you can see there that we have done exactly what we've said. We have introduced the idea and addressed the question. We've mentioned the 2 poems that we're going to do, Anthem for Doomed Youth and Dulce Decorum Est. And we've also alluded to the comparison that we're going to make. Anthem anticipates the futile loss, and then Dulce condemns those, such as governments, who promote and sanction such suffering. Once you've done an introduction, you really need to deconstruct both poems in detail. So in this case, if you were doing Anthem and Dulce, you would really need to do that. Towards the end of this presentation, you will see an exemplar response that does that. Take note of how much detail it has gone into. So what you've got here are some sample questions, and these are taken from past exam papers. Notice the sample question 3 in yellow. In what way does the poet draw you into the world of his poetry? What's going to follow is an exemplar response to the sample question 3. Note the introduction. Again, in the introduction, we have addressed the question, we have introduced Owen, we have told you which 2 poems that we're going to use, and we've alluded to the 2 themes or ideas that we are going to focus on. The first body paragraph regards Anthem for Doomed Youth, and you can see in yellow the quotes and also the techniques that we have used. So notice please, there's about 5 or 6 pieces of evidence. The evidence along with the analysis is really important for providing a strong basis for your argument. The second big body paragraph is on the second poem, Dulce Decorum Est, and notice again another 5 or 6 pieces of strong evidence that supports the point. The conclusion brings everything together. In this conclusion, we realise that his poetry still resonates with us today. He has left a really powerful poetic legacy that still has a major impact on attitudes to war today. I do hope this has helped you with your response. Please make sure that you are able to write enough in 40 minutes, and I would also suggest that you do a couple of timed responses under exam conditions to help you on the day. Good luck.